Thank you, Dr. Nazar. Thank you very much for showing interest in this topic. Of course, your president, President Constantinescu, could tell you as much about the World Academy as I can tell, because President Constantinescu is also a fellow of the World Academy, and as a matter of fact, we are together on the board of the Academy. But let me, nevertheless, since Mark and you expressed the desire that I tell you a few things about the World Academy, let me say a few things, and then, of course, whatever more or anything in details you would like to know, I will be ready to try to answer your questions if I can. Now, the Academy actually, just like several other things, have been contemplated about essentially after the Second World War. When you look at the history of all of the academies, now all of the academies start very early in the history. In the so-called Western civilization, it starts with the Academy of Plato, so this is more than 2,000 years old. And the Academy of Plato goes all the way until Justinian. And it was the Justinian who actually decided to close the Plato Academy. And then the academies were founded later on in Europe, and we consider that the oldest of all of the academies is the Accademia dei Lincei, the Italian Academy. And then after that was the French Academy, the Royal Society, and so on. So this is the 17th century. The French Academy was established by a person who is rather famous, and most of you do know him, is Cardinal Richelieu. And actually, Richelieu did it under the very specific idea. He is also in many ways regarded as a father of diplomacy and so on. So the paramount position of Richelieu was what is called in French raison d'etat, namely the justification based on a state. That state was France, or, as we would say today, this is one of so-called roughly 200 sovereign states. There are 200 sovereign states, and until basically the end of the Second World War, the only academies we had in the world were academies that were within a specific nation state. So it was the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America, established during the time of President Lincoln. As I said, Royal Society, established during the time of Charles II. French Academy, this was Louis XIII's, but of course the initiative came from Cardinal Richelieu, and so on. So this was the pattern. Now, it became obvious that the world, after the Second World War, cannot really live as composed of nation states. That more and more, the world is global. Now, the idea of the global world actually came already at the time after the First World War with the idea of the League of Nations, right? You remember there was a League of Nations, and then that League of Nations had not a very successful history. It was really due to the activities of Hitler and Mussolini and so on, basically destroyed. So after the Second World War, the United Nations were established. But United Nations, again, is an association based on sovereign states. You don't have representatives. There is an effort now, by the way, led by several people, including a gentleman by name Andreas Bummel and several of us in the World Academy, that it would be good to establish the Parliamentary Assembly of the United Nations. So that United Nations, just like European Union, would have its assembly, all right? Now, we still don't have that, and as you know, United Nations is really the assembly of representatives of each nation. So in a way, a very big nation like China and India have the same one vote as a very small one like Malta and Luxembourg, okay? Now, of course, to try to correct for that, the founding fathers of the United Nations made what? They made the famous Security Council. And they arranged the Security Council in a way which, again, today is not necessarily quite ideal because it's composed of so-called permanent members and of those who are rotating and being elected and so on. So with all of these shortcomings, it was clear that one needs something which would be global. Now the question is, why it should be the academy? Academy, originally from the time of Plato, had the idea of being for sciences and also, in a way, arts. Now, why science is so important? Science is so important because the world we live in, this world, which is global and interconnected and very fast changing, all of these features of this world, of this contemporary world, are science generated. So it makes sense to be science, okay? And this is why, at the initiative of people like Einstein, who is known to all of you, but also people like Oppenheimer, the person who was called engineer of the first nuclear bomb, Joseph Needham, the person who actually made a link between Chinese science and, let's call it, Western science, Lloyd, who was at that time the Director General of FAO, and several other of distinguished people actually decided to establish the Academy of Art and Science, World Academy of Art and Science. And this was done in 1960, so it was several years already after the death of Einstein. And as you can imagine, of course, it takes some time for anything to mature, so it was necessary first to have the Congress, many, many meetings, and so on. Now, roughly at the same time, again stimulated by Einstein, as a matter of fact, as a result of a famous manifesto written by Lord Bertrand Russell and Einstein, the so-called Russell-Einstein Manifesto, the so-called Pugwash movement was created in 1957. And then about 10 years later, in 1968, several people, led by Aurelio Peccei, Alex King, and so on, established what is called the Club of Rome. And these three organizations have in many ways actually very intimate collaboration. The World Academy, of course, is more emphasizing science and art. The World Academy is composed of roughly about 600 fellows. Why roughly? Because, of course, it's very difficult to keep track of everybody. The Academy, as all of the academies in the world, are mainly composed of old people, and unfortunately at each time somebody in her or his late age dies, and so this number constantly keeps changing, and we do have more and more fellows. Besides fellows, we have associate fellows and junior fellows. The Academy, of course, how to make the effective academy. Academy is really ruled by the plenum, which means all of the fellows. But you can imagine bringing 600 fellows in one place is very difficult. But now, luckily, of course, what do we have is we have electronic communication. So all the important things are being, like the election of the president and so on, or changing the constitution of the academy, are actually sent on the electronic ballot. The electronic ballot lasts typically about a month so that everybody can express her or his views. And this is one way how the academy actually makes its most important decision. The other way of making important decision is, of course, through various meetings. And the academy now, in the last year, has managed to organize about 6 or 7 meetings throughout the world. We will have one of the next meetings will actually be devoted to nuclear arms and in general to weapons of mass destruction. And that conference will precede the NATO conference on weapons of mass destruction, which will be in city of Split on the Adriatic. And so that meeting would be at the beginning of May. Then there will be a meeting in Geneva, organized in connection, as you know, United Nations has many offices and many agencies throughout the world. As I already mentioned, one is FAO, the other is UNESCO, the third is World Health The oldest of the United Nations institution is the ILO, the International Labour Organization. The ILO and the World Health Organization are actually located in Geneva, and they are there together with the UN Office of Geneva, UNOG, so-called. And the next meeting of the World Academy will be also there. And then we will have a meeting in Alexandria, where we will try to concentrate essentially on the Middle East and on North Africa. So that's another thing. Then, of course, the Academy has its Board of Trustees, a board composed of up to 25 fellows that are elected for 4 years and can be once re-elected. And among them, they choose the chair of the Board of Trustees. And the Board of Trustees is really the main body that does all daily decisions. And then the Academy also elects the president, who is a person whose duty, as you see now, is just exactly my duty, to come from a place to a place and to be in contact with people and tell few things about what the World Academy is and try to essentially inform the general audience, as you are, what the Academy is doing, and to receive from you ideas, comments, suggestions, and so on, how the Academy should be working in order to really meet this essential requirement that besides the United Nations General Assembly, which is composed of representatives of the country. So for instance, if you come to the General Assembly and there is a gentleman from Germany, he has to represent the official view of Germany. If he would not do that, immediately the Chancellor of Germany, the President of Germany, would call that person back and say, look, what are you doing, right? I mean, you're supposed to represent the view of Germany. Similarly, of course, the representative of Malta or representative of Luxembourg has the same responsibility to represent the view of these particular countries. In the case of the World Academy, though I am from Croatia, I have no obligation to represent Croatia, no obligation to defend the position of the government of Croatia. My only obligation is to try to be honest to all of you, to those to whom I speak, and to honestly represent my personal view. I can, of course, change and modify my view as a result of your suggestions. The general thing is that, of course, representing the World Academy, just you can say, is the same story as if I talk to you as a physicist. Now, as a physicist, I should not, of course, mislead you about essential results of the physics today. I should be able to tell you that, of course, there is a major effort and experiments going on currently in Geneva, in the Large Hadron Collider, where we believe we have actually found the particle which might be responsible why anything in nature has a mass, you, me, the hydrogen atom, electron, anything. But we are not sure that that is yet so. Namely, we are not sure whether the particle that we are fairly convinced exists is really the so-called Higgs boson. Now, of course, one of the features of science is that science is not about truth. Science is about finding truth. It's about pleasure of discovering important things. It's about ideas, but all ideas are in no way sacred that a better idea would not come. So one of the characteristics of science is this search, this constant effort to improve and to work. And there are many, many things which are now subject of the debate. Like, for instance, people would say, as you know, there is this big dispute about Darwinian theory of evolution and creationism. There is a question about global warming. There are a number of other things, and they are not going to stay there unchanged. No, as a matter of fact, will the theory of evolution, Darwinian theory of evolution, be changed? Of course. It was dramatically changed by the discovery, by the Nobel Prize winning discovery of Crick and Watson when we found out the idea of the DNA. And of course, anything else dealing with the genes and so on, all of that is constantly changing science. And this is why, as I said at the beginning, science is this enormous agent generating change. So these are a few words about the World Academy, and of course, all questions or comments are most welcome.
Thank you. I'll just start the conversation so that thank you very much for this beautiful explanation. Now, how can you see the academy? How can the academy influence the political situation now? You mentioned you have several meetings in Alexandria and in other places, in Geneva. But how can from your own perspective see the influence that the academy can achieve or do toward the existing politics?
There are several ways how the academy can do, and let me immediately make clear what is not the task of the World Academy. One thing which is not the task of the World Academy is to develop any specific scientific disciplines. The reason why this is not the task of the World Academy is, I told you, the number of the fellows is roughly 600. And of course it covers all of the disciplines, all right? So you can hardly say that there will be more than 50 physicists, to just stay to my own field. German Physical Society has several 100,000 physicists. They are all young and active and believing that 50 physicists in the World Academy can do as well as a much larger number, very active physicists in one country, that would be Germany, is making no sense. So obviously the duty to do research in physics, as I already mentioned, the search for the Higgs boson and so on, has to be done by institute devoted, in this particular case, to the narrow field of physics, particle physics. And they can do that. It's not the task of the World Academy. Similarly, of course, that would be with the nanotechnology, that would be with synthetic biology, that would be even the case for problems in sociology and so on. Now, there are certain things that, of course, the Institute of Physics or the American Physical Society or a German Physical Society cannot do. And this is this domain of interaction between physics and other domains, between physics and particularly those areas that are not natural sciences, but social sciences, to try to bring in this comparison, analogies between one and the other, to try, for instance, to say that what we do need today in the realm of economics, in the realm of the political science, is something very much similar to what physics undergone at the turn of the 19th to 20th century with quantum physics, with the theory of relativity, and so on. This is the task of the World Academy. It is the task of the World Academy also to say that at the moment, our situation in economy is full of really neglecting some of the most important features that we are facing. You know that, for instance, always the economy comes to discussing issues of capital. Already Adam Smith was talking about capital, and he clearly spoke about manufactured capital, and this is this, and the money, this is all manufactured capital. Then about the human capital, and about the natural capital. And when you look at the history, for instance, of the Club of Rome, was to point out the enormous importance of the natural capital, because the natural capital is something that in a way is given. We cannot enlarge it. Okay, is this quite true? That's true only to some extent. And let me tell you that. For instance, until very, very recently, of course, our Earth had all of the oil that we are exploiting now, but nobody knew that oil can be used in the engines of our cars and so on. So all of this was really much, much later on discovered. There is a classic example that is very nice to say. Not far from here, as a matter of fact, some 200 kilometers south from Berlin, in what is today the Czech Republic, but at that time was influenced under the Holy Roman Empire with the emperor who was a German and so on. There were very important mines, and these mines were there to, I believe, they were digging silver. And in the process of digging silver, mining silver, they were getting some rather unpleasant material. And since it was unpleasant, the miners used the term pechblende, pech being something bad, of course, right? So they call it pechblende. About 100 years later on, it turned out that this pechblende is the material, an ore, that contains an enormous amount of uranium. At that time, uranium was a nuisance, pech, right? Then, of course, uranium became the essential element, much, much more valuable than gold or diamonds, and essential for making nuclear bombs and making nuclear reactors. So, obviously, it is the human being that finds out something very important from all of these things, from the natural capital. That part is okay. But even if we keep discovering, even when we make gold out of stone, so to say, nevertheless, the amount of the total material on our Earth is finite. You could imagine that, of course, as we went from Europe and essentially colonized the entire Earth, we could try to colonize the universe, so to say, or at least our solar system. A famous physicist, cosmologist, Stephen Hawking, actually comes and says that either we will colonize or we will just die. I mean, there's no way, no other way. This is not that trivial. Colonizing the planets is much trickier than it was to go to America. And we can go into that discussion. But in any way, even if we do that, and I think we should do whatever we can to colonize, in no way we should destroy our Earth as we did not destroy Europe when we went across the Atlantic to America and around the Cape of Good Hope to India and so on. We did not destroy Europe, so we have to be very careful that we do not destroy the planet. But even if we colonize, we are still only incrementally increasing. So the natural resources are finite. Now we come to the third of the resources, and this is where now the World Academy is definitely focused on, and this is the human capital. Human capital is actually the richest one. We are not using in full our human capital. And the very important part of the human capital is the realization of human dignity. And now comes actually a very tricky thing, you know. You remember that some 40, 50 years ago, there were big discussions about exploitation, how bad it is to be exploited. And one of the young collaborators, she's a lady, Robinson, of famous economist John Maynard Keynes, said that the only thing which is worse than being exploited is not being exploited, which means that you are useless in a way, you know. So it is actually the World Academy's duty is to just open these possibly hidden, suppressed, not quite realized possibilities that can exist and that, of course, provide possibilities for new solutions. As I said, now, on one side is actually the question of the human capital. On the other hand, something which we keep forgetting It is in 45 that the two nuclear bombs were dropped, first on Hiroshima and then on Nagasaki. The amount of bombs, nuclear bombs, that now exist in the world is about almost 1 million times more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I don't know whether any one of you visited those cities. I had been there on several occasions, and I have seen the documents, and it's really terrible. And of course, if power, almost 1 million times bigger, would be used, that would destroy our civilization several times over and over through various things, and we can go in details on that if anyone is interested. Now, the trouble is, you can say, of course, our political leaders are clever, and I don't want to go into this discussion whether or not they are clever or not. But the story is that more than 10% of these weapons are on a so-called trigger alert. Trigger alert means that they are being launched as soon as there is a blip somewhere saying, aha, there is a nuclear bomb that is going to hit us, whatever us is, by whoever else is using this against us. And so we better retaliate and send the bomb to them. And of course, this trigger alert is a terrible thing. And since this is about 10% of the total stock, it means we will just about destroy the civilization we have, because the amount that we have now of weapons is enough to destroy it about 10 times. And the acronym for that is mutually assured destruction. This is the expression, and the acronym becomes MAD, MAD. And of course, it's perfectly correct to call this MAD, because it's really totally ridiculous to use this. Humankind, of course, had war for many ages. The war is not necessarily, we are not doomed to war. There were civilizations that lived for a long time without war, so we don't have to be in the war. But never we had the weapons that could destroy the humankind so definitely as weapons of mass destructions are.
Okay, we open the floor for any question from, yes?
Questions? Thank you for your presentation. My question is, since you talked a lot my name is Sofia. I'm coming from Bulgaria, and I work in the ICD. My question is, you spoke a lot about science and these weapons for mass destruction. And since this is Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, do you think that somehow cultural diplomacy can cooperate with physics and, with your institute, so to try countries not to use these weapons for mass destruction?
Definitely, cultural diplomacy can do quite a lot. Let me give you the first an answer by going to something which maybe I should have said before. As I said, there are... there is over there, yeah. So that I don't have to sit all the time. As I said, there are 200 sovereign states, but there are about 5,000 different cultures. 5 to 10,000, 5,000 different cultures and different languages. Now, are we interested in them? Absolutely, because they represent something genuinely different. When you look, for instance, at science that we made, we have to admit that this is the science that was essentially determined by Greek mathematics, Greek philosophy, and then the Western development starting from Galileo, Newton, and today. Possibly, different cultures can contribute quite a lot. one of the very important examples, simple example, is actually the following. Theory of relativity teaches us that time and space are not, as we usually think, two different things, one from the other, but as a matter of fact, connected. And there was a famous science saint, philosopher, St. Augustine, in the 4th century, who was very much concerned about the question of time. And so he was asked about time, what he thinks about time, and so on. And he said, if you don't ask me, I think I know what time is. But if you ask me, I really cannot say that. And then the question was to him, does the time have the beginning? And of course, as you know, Kant later on, practically 2,000 years after St. Augustine, argued that time, and of course we, in a very simple problems in physics or anywhere else, you assume that time goes from minus infinity to plus infinity, okay? And the space, you don't quite know, but maybe space also is infinite. Maybe it isn't. You never think whether space is flat or curved, but it is. Okay, now it turns out that St. Augustine really thought maybe time has the beginning. And then the question to him was, so what was God doing before the beginning of time? And alleged answer, which is not true, he didn't say that, but the story is that he replied and said, God was prepare hell for those that ask that question. Now, that has no connection with truth. The true answer that St. Augustine gave was, there was no time before the creation of the world. And that answer is remarkably correct. This is exactly what theory of relativity now strongly argues. The space and time start with matter. Before matter, there is no space, and there is no time. The reason why I mention all of that is, I don't know whether anyone, no, I don't see anyone that maybe comes from Africa, but
Professor.
Yes?
I mean, I just want to interject here part of the religious part, because with Kabbalah, which is the old teaching of Kabbalah, it all talks about the same thing.
Absolutely.
So how the mix of that comes with science?
And I will comment on that. But let me say, now coming to this question of cultural diplomacy and multiculturalism, there is a Nobel laureate poet from, I believe, Nigeria, who wrote about the difference in perceiving time. Of course, coming of a Western civilization, make a husband believing that time is what you see on the clock, on your watch, and therefore that you can waste time. He actually argues very, very correctly that time is, you make all the time that you want. And in many African cultures, the time is precisely that things which science believes, namely that time is not just ticking, click, 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 and therefore the various cultures have very much of the different approach. And suppose if physics would have started in Africa rather than in Europe, if Einstein would have been a person from Nigeria, he may have a much simpler time in discovering the theory of relativity, because his prejudices, and he had prejudices of his own culture, just like I have prejudices of my own culture, do prevent. I mean, he was, for instance, extremely influenced by Spinoza. And to tell you an example about him, he did not want to believe that the universe changes. For him, this was impossible, because Spinoza and all the philosophers he believed very strongly that the universe is static. A young gentleman, Russian physicist, Alexander Friedman, writes him a letter and says, you know, Professor Einstein, your equation allows for the universe to expand. Einstein said this is nonsense, throws this into the wastebasket. Then there is a French Jesuit, Lemaitre, who comes with the same thing. Of course, Einstein again does the same thing, throws this into a wastebasket. And then it turns out about 10 years after that, that Hubble finds experimental evidence that the universe is really expanding. That is just like a cake, you know, that when you are baking it, then of course it expands, and the distance between those raisins increase, and that is exactly the same thing. Now, what you have asked, of course, the very important question is, we do find that some of the very, very important things in science have somehow be felt, I don't know whether there is any better word to be used than the word felt, in many of old philosophy, in many of old religions, in many of old views. Regardless whether this is in the Rig Vedas, whether this is in the Buddhist religion, or in Judaism, or in Islam. Of course, out of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam came essentially being constantly enriched. You know, I mean, telling that Islam ruined the original Jewish views is partly true, but also partly wrong, because all of this is just like you cannot tell that Cubism and Impressionism has ruined the world of Michelangelo or Leonardo. This is all the expression of this enormous human creativity. And I think that cultural diplomacy has just this possibility of overcoming certain things and opening totally new languages. For instance, people in Europe have, for many, many ages, fought wars. People in Latin America, in what is today Peru, had a civilization that for 500 years was at peace with their neighbors and did not fight wars. We had some wars which were extremely cruel, and now what we have is, for the considerable amount of time, actually ever since the Second World War, we are trying to do the so-called clean killing, kill allegedly those that we won't kill, that we want to kill, to eliminate, and not the others, no matter how stupid that is. But okay. So yes, I think that cultural diplomacy is extremely important. I apologize for a long answer, but you know, professors always have this tendency of enjoying to listen to themselves.
Thank you very much. Any other question? Yeah, he's here. David.
Hi there, Professor Slaus. Thank you very much for what you've said thus far. My name is David. I'm an intern at the ICD. I'm from London. I'd like to move away from physics for a moment, which we were talking about previously, and talk about human capital, as you mentioned in your presentation. At the ICD, we've just established a new organisation called the Organisation for Youth Education and Development. And obviously one of the massive kind of matters we're dealing with right now is the youth unemployment crisis, particularly in Southern Europe. So there clearly are a lot of educated young people in Europe. It's just that their human capital, their education isn't being put to use because there aren't any jobs. And I'd like to, first of all, get your opinion on this waste of human capital. And also, do you have any opinion or suggestions on what can be done to alleviate the problem? Thank you.
The human capital is a subject that has been with us for a long time, but very recently became very, very prominent. There is a recent publication published by the UN University, which originally was located in Tokyo, but now has its affiliates throughout, one in Germany, I believe in Bonn. And this effort is led by a professor of economy in Cambridge, at Cambridge University, Sir Partha Dasgupta. They published this. It's a big, big report called Inclusive Wealth Report. Okay, now this is a very important question. I mean, what is, the title of the famous book by Adam Smith is The Wealth of Nations. That was published in 1776. And of course, it is almost the Bible of capitalism, except that, of course, all those who are now preaching capitalism have not read Adam Smith and know very little about that, just as people who were bringing communism all around the world never actually read Marx Das Kapital. Partly because this is a difficult thing to read, so much better is to just make out of nonsense. So anyway, Serparta comes with the analysis of about 20 countries so far. They are working on on all of the 200, and this result have been published in The Economist. And what they come there with the conclusion, and I will tell you the conclusion, and then I will tell you what I think there are, I mean, not what I think, but what they think are a lot of unfinished businesses. So it's an unfinished symphony. They actually study, among other countries, United States, United Kingdom, Brazil, Russia, Saudi Arabia, okay? And they claim the figures, so just to bring you where you are, you know that the GDP, gross domestic product, of the United States is of the order of $15 trillion. They claim that the inclusive wealth of United States is not 15, but $110 trillion. And that the difference is largely human capital and to a lesser extent, natural capital. The only country where the natural capital is much bigger than the human capital is Russia. And we know that, unfortunately. Russia is about the only country that we are really aware of in terms of extensive studies and so on, that has a decreasing life expectancy rather than increasing. Everywhere else is increasing. And on the other hand, of course, Russia is enormously rich in terms of the natural capital. So, okay, the story is human capital is the most important part. According to them, represents around 70 and more % of the total wealth of nation. Now, continuing in what is easy and what we all understand. What is the human capital composed of? The first thing is, of course, health. You really want people to be healthy. And we have several measures of health. One measure of health, actually, and life expectancy is one measure. The other, of course, is the so-called child mortality. One has to be very careful. For instance, most of the European countries have a very low children mortality until the age of 5. Country that is highly developed, like United States, has disproportionately large child mortality, which is one of the problems that has various reasons and so on. So health, by all means, is a very important thing. But not necessarily something which is prohibitive, because, let me give you an example, though you said keep off physics. I will tell you an example of Stephen Hawking, whom I have mentioned, and presumably most of you have seen rather dreadful pictures of Stephen Hawking, who is in a wheelchair, cannot speak, cannot do anything. This happens when he is now 70, I believe, 70-something. His diagnosis happened when he was 20-something. Nevertheless, he married. His wife at that time, his fiancée, decided to marry him, and they have several children, I believe 3 children. One daughter still works with him and helps him in writing the books. But as you see, he cannot speak, he cannot move, he needs constant help, but he's fully alive. I mean, he's publishing, he has recently published. He recently said that, of course, as we quoted, unless we go off the earth, and he obviously sees himself in a wheelchair in one of those things zooming off the earth, you know, he will do that. And since he, in the meantime, got divorced and remarried and divorced again, obviously he is a very, very active person. So health is important, but is not the most important thing, but definitely is important. The other thing is education. Because if you don't know certain things, then you are in a position to always rediscover the, so to say, hot water and so warm water and things like that. So education obviously is of utmost importance. And then the next thing which is important is your activity, your connection with your fellow human being. Imagine that you are extremely clever, that you produce all papers and so on, but you never publish anything. You never communicate to other people, then obviously this is not. So, okay, these are all various measures, how we measure. And then therefore, we look at objective things like the education in certain countries, like the permanent lifelong education and so on. But the question now, which of course we don't know how to do, and nobody really knows how to do, and let me tell you also that we don't know that in a simpler case of the natural capital. In the case of the natural capital, when you want to actually have an account of the oil, and that comes to the market, right? Now, what do you take into account? You take into account how difficult it is to extract that, okay? And how much there is there to be extracted in an equally difficult or an equally easy way, okay? And this is why now you have seen that in the United States suddenly, due to the development of these various possibilities, you have again a certain boom. The United States has been very careful not to use its own oil, but to use the oil from the Middle East just to keep the reserves and so on. But this is a longer story. But anyway, this is what we do. Now, if we want to do better, we could calculate the cost produced by pollution, either by producing this, extracting that, mining them, or using them, whatever. We could do that. And that still has not been done, but it can be done. In the case of the human capital, is much trickier. We don't really know how to express that in money. Now, money is a really tricky thing, by the way. You know, I was recently at the conference on money. The money we have used to be essentially based on the gold standard, but for a long, long time is not based on a gold standard. And the money we have is based only on what is called the rule. A sovereign country, a definition of the sovereign country is to print as much money as it wants. One of the reasons of the problem of the euro that we have now is that, of course, all of the countries have to follow the rules without having the same fiscal policy. So they are imposing the monetary policy, fixing this, and there is no fiscal policy, so this is what happens. So basically, to come to the human potential, to the human capital is extremely important. It gets this enriched category through this social capital, but we don't know how to measure it. See, our problem is really, in general, in economy, we don't know how to measure. This, by the way, is also the problem in political sciences. We don't know how to measure. Now, measure, again, contrary to what you wanted, in physics, we did develop quite well the ideas of measuring. You do know that you can say, you are taller or less tall than I am. You are heavier, your foot is bigger or not. We know that. This is very, very simple. But in the case of economy, what we know, by the way, is the measure that we all use, the so-called gross domestic product, is the wrong measure. And everybody knew that from the very beginning. But now we do the following things. We use this measure because we don't have anything better. And it does help us in certain ways. Not everything, but it does help. So I'm sorry I gave you not the half of answer to your question. But this is the grim situation.
Thank you very much. Any question from the? Okay. Yeah. You have a question? No? Okay. You have a question? Okay. You have the. Okay.
I just wanted to ask, coming back to, you were talking about the search of the truth, and I was wondering how does the new technologies and the new way we experience reality influences in this search of the truth. Have we become perhaps more impatient or less, or do we have such an amount of information that is more complicated to get into the right way, or how does it influence us in this sense?
Okay, your question is very rich. It contains several parts. One part is actually the question of truth as such. And as I said, the business of science is not truth. Our business is to look for answers to specific problems, to try to make certain generalization that might be more general. And when you compare, for instance, what we have done in physics with what is in economy or in social sciences, physics, for instance, said whatever Newton said is not true. But no, be more careful. What Newton said is true, but only if you move very slowly. If you move very fast, it's not true. You have to use the theory of relativity. And if you are disturbing the system, then you also cannot use the classical physics. You have to use essentially quantum physics. So you have to be careful. What is the domain of your truth? See, in typical other things, we want to have the general truth, you know. No, it is actually valid for only certain things. And this is presumably where we will be, because it might turn out, as again we know, for instance, in science, in physics, we believed some 20 years ago, that we almost understand everything. And our understanding, we labeled the standard model. Then various experiments showed us that we really understand about 4% of the universe. That 24% of the universe we don't understand and is labeled dark matter. And we really don't know what dark matter is. So our total lack of knowledge is hidden under the term dark matter. And then 72%, we even understand less. And this is something which is called dark energy. And the only interesting thing, coming back to the first question that young lady from Bulgaria asked, is that this happens now after 40 years after Einstein's death. And Einstein, when he did not want this universe to expand, then he added a strange constant, and then later on, when he was proven wrong, then he said that this is the greatest mistake he made. Now it turns out that this constant that he added may be exactly this dark energy. So this shows how little we understand. Our understanding is just about 4 to 5%. So that is one part. The other part of your question deals with the enormous progress in technology. Now, the progress in technology, first thing to realize is that progress in technology is science-generated, is not trial and error as it used to be centuries ago. Now it's all science-generated, okay? And now what is that product? For instance, it may very well be that if we have serious problem, let's say with our spinal cord, we do with our body whatever we do with the car. Namely, you go to a person, you say, you know, I have a problem with my back, my knees don't work very well, and so on. Can you replace that? And then the machinist, the MD, whoever it is, replaces this part of your body, replaces that part of your body. You are not quite happy with the way as you see, and you do that. You remember a long time ago, actually, the color of the eyes was a distinguishing feature that you would fall in love with. Now, any one of you can put whatever you want, change in the morning to have brown, to have green in the afternoon to suit your trousers, blouse, or whatever. So, yes, we might come to the question that we may live much longer than what we live now. We don't know what we will do that. There is an English, Aubrey de Grey, who actually argues that in principle we don't have even to have children. We can continue with us indefinitely. hundreds, thousands, and so on. On the other hand, when you look at the nature, there is the so-called immortal jellyfish. So nature knows some of these things. So let's be careful. We don't know. The only question we do know is that we are often not quite clever enough to handle our own discoveries. And let me comment on a discovery that was made 100 years ago, that is, all of you are very familiar, and that is the X-rays. This was the first Nobel Prize, right? When the X-rays was discovered, then very quickly, people noticed some very useful, quote-unquote, application. Useful application that never took off, luckily, was that people noticed that it was done by men. You know, men are basically, in general, lazy. And so they said, why should I shave every day? So let me try not to shave. And they discovered that actually X-rays called essentially all these hair and so on to drop. So they were thinking, okay, why don't we expose ourselves occasionally to X-rays and get rid of our beard, mustaches, and so on. Luckily, this was never implemented. You imagine that would be the end of men, and at least for a while, serious drawback to the human race. But the thing that was actually used was, and now this is the other half of the humankind that really likes shoes and wants to have shoes all the time and proper size and so on. So they thought, okay, the way how the shoes fits me is very important. Otherwise, you know, it's very difficult. So let us, at the time when we are buying the shoes, step on the X-ray and see whether our toes and so on are properly there. So for a while, and that lasted about 2 or 3 decades, in shoe shops, people could actually check that, and you could imagine an enormous disastrous effect that that had, particularly if that person would be pregnant. That would be totally disastrous. Luckily, of course, now we just change the shoes, buy other shoes, have this Manolo Blahnik and whatever they are called, you know, and then you have all of these things, and so you don't have to do the X-rays anymore. But we have to be damn careful, excuse me, for using the technology that we invent whenever we invent them.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah, you have a question?
Sorry.
Okay, sorry.
It's not a question related to physics, but more politics. I just wanted to get your perspective on North Korea, and in your view, how can the tensions be resolved in that region and the role of the international community?
Sorry, which region?
North Korea.
North Korea.
And nuclear weapons, and the role of the international community in resolving the tensions.
Okay, the question of nuclear weapons is a very tricky question, and when you look, 90% of nuclear weapons is in the hand of the two states, USA and Russia. Then you can ask yourself a question why, for instance, a country like England has nuclear weapons, why France has nuclear weapons, why India, Pakistan, and eventually would be or Israel, and then eventually why North Korea has nuclear weapons. Since I belong to a group of people called European Leadership Network that is basically composed of politicians, and by the way, though I'm a physicist, I did spend about 5 years in politics. I was a member of the parliament, so I know a little bit about that. The reason why I'm told that France wants to have nuclear weapons, believe it or not, is because of Germany. Why because of Germany? Because if France would not have nuclear weapons, then it would be very normal that France loses its seat in the Security Council, and that the seat comes to another country out of the European Union. Why not? And then, of course, it could be Germany or it can be Luxembourg. So they would lose that. The same thing applies to UK, you know. So they are in a Security Council, though they are by no means neither politically nor economically as powerful. So the reason for having the bomb is really very, very strange. As far as Israel is concerned, for instance, there was a question, and published, by the way, as an opinion of an American policy maker from the military side, who said, believe it or not, why Israel wants to have a bomb? Because of United States. Why? Because then Israel can behave as a child who really tells the United States, you defend me against them, because if not, then I will use the bomb and do all of these things. Okay. Now, North Korea, basically, if North Korea would start anything, the United States can destroy it in no time, right? Because they have possibly 3 or 4 bombs compared to, and these bombs are not as important, not as powerful as those that United States has, and United States has 20,000 bombs, so they would destroy that. They actually primarily use this to bluff. So essential story is to bluff. Now the bluff is, just like in the case of France and Germany, is not, France doesn't have the bomb to even during the Cold War, to protect them from the Soviet Union at that time. No, they are playing a much narrower game. So here, Kim Un actually uses this in his own fight against the people who are obviously much more influential than he is in North Korea. He wants to show himself that he is man important and so on. He wants to be given, he also has this problem of being recognized as an important leader. And he has no way to prove that, in his opinion, except by playing this very dangerous game of the bomb. He also presumably wants to homogenize his people, because the situation there is a terrible situation. Really, they are almost on a situation where they are spending an enormous amount of money for weapons, for military, and none for the need of the people. The problem is, of course, that most of us know very little about North Korea. Even those who had the privilege of being there, visiting them, and so on, is really a country tightly protected with very little transparency and so on. Now, my personal view would be to try to really continue diplomacy in all forms and avoid confrontations. Because though North Korea would be quickly destroyed, would not be supported by either Russia or China, as a matter of fact, very likely both of them would be not interested in protecting them. The last thing that the world wants now is any kind of the nuclear war, even if this is just, I apologize for using the word, just few nuclear bombs being dropped on any country. So peaceful solutions have to be found, and people of North Korea deserve decent life, and getting them decent life is not just the duty of their leadership, is the duty of all of the world, and if we can help them, let us help them and try to do something, try to really, because when a person behaves in a way which is erratic, which is destructive and so on, and you can see that with children age 4 on, and with human beings, all ages, and with countries, all ages and so on, let us try to overcome the real source of the problem. Many of these countries, for instance, in the story with Iran, between United States and Iran, and Israel and Iran, I think one has to really make Iran feel that nobody really wants to abruptly change the regime and bring these people, no matter whether you agree with them or not, to court or anything like that. The solution is to try, our solution of all of us should be to try to have a world which is better to live in and where everybody is happier. Now, that might not be easy. That is extremely difficult. It might look actually utopian, whatever you want. But the trouble of using the bomb, let me assure you, is much worse of the situation, particularly because all the things that so-called military strategists think about is nuclear war between states. But we have much worse scenarios. One worse scenario is use of dirty nuclear weapons, where you cannot retaliate because there is no state to retaliate to. And then even worse, what former president of the Royal Society, Lord Martin Rees, said with biological weapons. This is really a nightmare. And he said, in any global village, in any village, and so in a global village, there is always a village idiot. And that village idiot can do harmful things. And with this biological weapons, we can really terribly destroy everything. And while in order to have nuclear weapons, you cannot easily make nuclear weapons. You do need some, just like to make an airplane, like to make a car, you have to have some economic and industrial development. But in order to make some of the biological weapons, you can do almost in a, in your kitchen, so to say. So it's much, much more dangerous. And we have to really bring to the full understanding of each individual that violence is something that we cannot, as human race, tolerate. That violence is much, much too bad, and there is no reason for violence.
Thank you very much.